is interested in it at all. So Memcache is basically, according to Danga, who are the people who make it, it's high performance distributed memory object caching system, yada yada yada. But what it really means is that it's stored in memory super fast, read and see, and it's scalable because it's distributed. So you can say things like, oh, okay, I have one box, so all this stuff in the cache, and I'm running out of space, so I'll just add another box, and then another box, etc., etc., etc. So who uses it? So it was written for and by LiveJournal, a company called Danga, who's run off a lot of little things from that. It's also used by Dave, Facebook, Wikipedia, GameSpot, Mod, which is a Rails app I don't think I did that star, and 43 Things, which is a Rails app also. As far as how we use it, the library is a gem, so you just install the gem. The -y is to include all the dependencies, which I don't think there really are any. And then basically the setup is usually just edit your environment.rb, add some config stuff, which is basically require the gem, set up some options for it, configure the cache, you set up the servers. This could be one or many, it's just an array. So this could be a single box on multiple ports, multiple box on whatever, doesn't matter. And then basically set up the session options for it, plug it in for, in this case I'm using it for fragment caching and also for storing my sessions. And then I can also access this object directly, the cache object, and set things in the cache, pull them into the cache, all that stuff. This little require down here is basically a utility library that wraps it up, kind of does some nice stuff, outputs logging when you use it, that kind of stuff. And as far as the actual usage, hello. So this is a super, super basic usage of it. You would say, basically in your controller, you'd have a method, and you would just put things in the cache and get them out. The other thing that's nice about Memcache is it supports timeouts. So you can set something in the cache and say this is good for 10 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes, forever. Forever is kind of a relative term in the Memcache world because once you restart the cache, you lose everything. So don't put super, super important stuff there. And then obviously, this isn't the whole truth, so this is the simple setting real basic data types, which kind of heads into the gotchas, which is you can only store things that are marshaled. So you can store something like an anonymous class. You can't store a lot of meta things because there's no way for it to basically figure out what it is when it comes back out. Marshaled objects that pull out of the cache are not caught by the reloader. So what happens is when the code gets operated on, the reloader basically doesn't have time to pick that up. And the autoloader is part of Rails, so it runs through. You pull it out of the cache, and it says, oh, hey, what's this thing? If it doesn't know what it is, it'll basically bark. So that's what the whole, it's not the whole truth. You can't just pull something easily out of the cache. You have to, if it's a complex data type, you have to require the class that it is. Yeah, it's not a replacement for a database, which is basically means if you need to pull a lot of stuff out of a database, do joins and stuff like that, you can't expect to basically put things in the cache, pull it out, and be able to do joins and things like that. It's not going to work. Yeah, so it's not easy to query the cache for a specific key. You can't easily, you can't basically willy-nilly like set stuff in the cache because there's no way for you to be able to find out easily where it is. You can walk the cache, but it's slow. So you can stack the cache, it'll tell you everything that's in it, and then you basically go from the top and look at the list. It's not the best thing. So you really have to know what's in the cache in your specific setup. And then the limits are a meg, so you can't stuff it full of insane amounts of data. And certain characters don't work for setting the keys, so you can't have white spaces in the keys, you can't have percent signs, stuff like that. There's certain characters, but that's all in the spec.
Question about not querying the cache for a specific key. Am I thinking about this backwards, or is that talking about looking for a specific value?
It's value, right? So, sorry. Yeah. So it's easy to get a key. It's not easy to get a value, right? You can't say, hey, give me value block or all the values of block in the cache without walking it the other way and walking each key. And then the other thing I was going to do quickly is I have a tiny little example of something. So maybe I want to bounce around a second. I created a controller that just quickly kind of is an example of each way of using it. And I think all the basic stuff is pretty normal. I kind of explained the part where you have to require the class. So, okay, so you set something in the cache here, this object, you set some attributes on it, you store it. When you go to pull it out, if you pull the object, it'll basically say, hey, I don't know how to deal with an object of type foobar, in this case. And so you have to make sure that the class is required. You have to manually do it. There's no other way. And then basically, I think the thing where it's really useful is anytime you have a method or something like that. So I'll use an example here. So this guy will probably take about, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 seconds, maybe more. So this is the fib method. So it's like basically you say, I want the fib for 35, and it'll basically iterate this and go from 35, 34, 33, 32, 30, to get all the way down to basically, it's a recursive, basically a recursive call on itself. And so that's how long it took for it to operate. If I were to cache this thing, so there. So that's the difference in time for it to run the cache versus non-cache version. Because what I'll do is, when it starts at the bottom, it basically caches each one as it goes. Has to call the same method, n plus 1 times for however. And so, kind of speeds it up in that way. That's about all I
Back to this card for a second.
Yeah. Control?
No, I was just looking at the fifth.
Oh, jeez. No. So, right. So the whole bit is basically you pass in a value. In my case, I was passing in 35. And what I would do is just set in the cache the number that I received. And this method calls itself, which is here and here. So 2 calls to itself on every request. That's why it's so slow, right? It's calling itself over and over and over. And then basically every time I check to see if it's in the cache, it's not there, I put it. And then next call ends up calling it again. Obviously it's in the cache next request, so kind of illustrates how much faster it is than having to call things continuously. I wouldn't say it's a great example, but it gives you kind of an idea of how much faster it could be the other way.
What would you say, like, there's we have a situation where you have 2 applications that are going to be running on the same box, and we'd like to have it so there's shared authentication,
Right.
and even, if possible, that they actually share session, like their session object in Rails. Like, would this be a way of implementing that? Is this a session that would 2 apps both be able to access the same cache?
Yes, so I should have, there's a caveat. This is actually, so I'm running Memcache locally, and I'm also using it for session storage, which I neglected to say. But this is very debugged. It normally doesn't output this much garbage. And basically when I set up the cache, which I really didn't sit on for very long, I basically specified a namespace, which isn't really, if it is, but it's not. You basically are appending some data to the front of it. So if you were to specify the same, basically in both apps, if you were to say the cache lived here and I don't namespace it anyway, you could pull data out.
You said you actually implemented the session on top of Memcache. Is that
It's all part of Rails.
okay? So that's invisible.
Yeah.
When you okay.
It's just a
so-
setting in the environment file. You
Right.
just say, bang, there it is.
I didn't realize Rails supported that.
Yeah,
That's
so it actually supported a long time before this library existed, but it was a really bad implementation of Memcache before, and it didn't work out very well until this one got it. So this is where I set it. I basically say, the cache object is this cache that I just created, which is just a Memcache, and then I end up updating the default session options here with my settings. That's really all there is.
So if I had both apps using the same namespace string,
Right.
they would share the same cache.
Yeah, or you could just, if you don't want to do it session-based, you could just do something like this block here, and then access the cache object directly, which is what I do. So for all the example things.
Is there any thread safety on the Memcache object, so I can put it on there?
So that's a good question, and I would say I do not know the answer to that. I would guess Probably. There is some threading in the Memcache client, but as far as how thread safe it is, I can't honestly say. We didn't have, so I used this before on a couple of sites, and we haven't had any issues with it, and obviously LiveJournal and some other people who get a lot of hits use it. They don't seem to indicate that there's any serious issues.
I think the server side is thread safe.
Yeah, I'm sure, right. I guess from my point of view, I'd say on the Ruby end, yeah, I mean, maybe it's not an issue because of single threadedness, right? But, yeah, maybe, so. That's it. Any questions at all?
Do you have to do the explicit puts and stores all the time from within your model, or is there any way to make it more transparent?
So, yeah. You mean as far as this kind of stuff?
Yeah.
So there are actually a lot of ways that you could do it if you wanted to. I didn't want to get really detailed, but yeah, there's really easy ways. You could wrap this method. You could alias this method easily if you're into that sort of thing, and or whatnot. And you could right. And so basically, you could alias the original method and basically wrap it in this code, this stuff. So you could say, alias the original method. Try and get it into the cache. Oh, it's not there. Okay, call the original method. So you still would end up
But
having.
there's nothing out there already that takes care of all that.
You could even just like create a pseudo hash that as the
Right.
overloads the operator, so you can treat a variable as a hash, and it's just a cache
Right.
variable.
Yeah.
So a
Totally.
class variable or something, which is your cache.
Well, just to kind of clarify what I think you said before, you're doing two things here. You're accessing it manually and getting and putting to it, but you also implemented your session storage with it. So when you read and write things to just the session
Yep.
Rails local method, that's putting and getting into the cache invisibly.
Well, right, and so
Or
I guess
not.
I should have said differently. But okay, good question. So right, and so the other issue with this is that when I set this stuff into the cache, I'm setting it into the same cache. I guess that's the question, right? It's kind of, is all this stuff going to the same place?
Right.
Okay, so it is, and I guess the way that it's safe for me to set objects is I would have to physically say, oh, okay, this is namespaced in this way, yada, yada, yada.
So I think what you're saying is you don't necessarily need a specific cache object if you have Memcache back in your sessions, because then you can just use
Right, you
sessions.
could store it and say totally. Yeah, you got it.
But you wouldn't want to do that inside your model.
Right.
Just putting that on there.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, you couldn't even, right, you can't see the session stuff inside the model anyway, so you have to pass it in, which, right. It's like, once you do that, you realize you're probably too far.
Along the same lines as two apps sharing the same cache,
Yeah.
what's to stop another app from looking at the other app's cache?
Well, so there's not, but there is, right? So that's
you.
probably a terrible thing to say. But so it all comes down to this, which is the namespace.
Mhm.
So it's your choice, right? If you namespace your app, you're saying I don't want to be in the same space as this other app. I want my own place, which is fine. Or you could choose to namespace your app in the same way and then access the same cache, and you run the risk that you're going to pull somebody else's data potentially. So.
And the cache service too, you can add multiple cache service.
Right,
You know,
so-
and you can weight them also.
Yeah.
So.
So, right, so I could add another one, right, if I wanted to. So if it was running at this point, it would probably blow up about half the time, give or take. So, yeah.
So are you relying on like your at service not being available to prevent people from getting into your cache? Or do they just have like if I know your namespace keyword and
Well,
like